Greetings to all of you from Singapore. I am director of the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you today for our webinar with some leading experts on energy security, transition, and geopolitical crises. And unfortunately, we are right now in one of the most significant geopolitical energy crises, I would say, for a long time. And we know it's revolving around the issue of the Hormuz Strait. And so today, with experts, we will be discussing the energy aspect to this. And I'm very happy to introduce first our moderator, but also the person who really initiated this, Dr. Mohammed Hazrati, who is a senior research fellow at CIL at our International Energy Law and Policy program. So I turn over to you, Mohammed, to make some introductory comments.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Niloufar. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone, depending on where you are joining us today. And welcome to our webinar on energy security, transition, and geopolitical crisis. My name is Mohammed Hazrati, a senior research fellow at the NUS Center for International Law. And we are meeting at a moment of profound global disruption, not only in the energy systems, but also in the international legal order. On 28 February 2026, Israel and United States launched a series of strikes against Iran, which almost all international law experts have described it as a clear violation of international law. In response, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical checkpoints in the global energy system, which is the focus of our discussion today. Behind the painful human toll of the war, the war has also caused serious disruptions to energy systems, which is the focus of our discussion today. At this stage, we don't know what the next steps will be as the ceasefire approaches its deadline. It remains unclear and uncertain whether the United States and Iran will reach a lasting peaceful agreement, although we can remain hopeful. However, we can reflect on and discuss the consequences that have emerged so far. Without further ado, let me now briefly introduce our distinguished speakers and the focus of their presentations. For detailed biographies, please refer to the link shared in the chat box. We'll begin with Dr. Niloufar Oral, Director of the Center for International Law at the International University of Singapore. Dr. Oral is a member of the UN International Law Commission and served as a chairperson of its 74th session. She is also co-chair of the ILC study group on sea level rise and a member of the curatorium of the Hague Academy of International Law. Drawing on her extensive experience in international law, Dr. Oral will open the discussion by addressing the critically important issue of the legal regime governing straits. We will then hear from Dr. Mirza Sadaqat Huda, Senior Research Fellow at ODI Global. His research focuses on regional electricity grids, critical minerals, energy security, and just energy transition. And he's the lead author of the report on the ASEAN Power Grid 2.0. Dr. Huda will discuss the implications of the current crisis for energy security in ASEAN. Our third speaker is Dr. Lee Chen Sim, Assistant Professor at Khalifa University in the United Arab Emirates. Dr. Sim is a specialist in the political economy of Gulf and Russian energy, with a particular focus on their global and regional interactions. She'll bring the Middle Eastern perspective to the discussion, examining how crisis is reshaping energy dynamics in the region. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Chen Gang, Deputy Director and Senior Research Fellow at the East Asian Institute, National University of Singapore. Dr. Chen work focuses on Chinese politics, foreign policy, energy, and environmental policies. He'll conclude the panel by offering insights from China's perspective on the evolving energy and geopolitical landscape. We will then have 30 minutes for Q&A. Please feel free to submit your question in the Q&A box during the presentations. Unfortunately, Dr. Huda has to leave early, so he will not be able to join the Q&A session. Just as a gentle reminder that each speaker has 15 minutes, we would be grateful if you could keep to time so that we have enough time for the Q&A. By this, let me now invite our first speaker, Dr. Nilufar. Dr. Nilufar, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Hazrati. And well, I have to say, I started my career in international law on the topic of straits, and that was over 20 years ago. And never did I think it would make so much headline news as it is now, in words such as transit passage, all very technical terms, but regrettably, we are now in one of the most serious geopolitical crises, and all rotating around this very narrow waterway, the Hormuz Strait. And so, what I'm going to do very briefly today is give a little bit of the international law background to this crisis. Because I hear a lot, what exacts it, freedom of navigation, transit passage, all that. So first of all, there are something called critical choke points, and those who are in energy know this. And the Hormuz Strait is one out of maybe 10 critical choke points. Critical choke points, particularly for energy. That means that these are specific waterways, straits and canals, like the Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandab is another one, the Turkish Straits, another one, where really much of a significant amount of energy goes through. So they are efficient routes. They cut the distance for transportation. I recently learned that the speed of one of these very large crude carriers for oil travels at the speed of 10 or 15 knots, which is like a bicycle speed. And so the shorter the route, the quicker it gets to us, and also it impacts price. Now, when you block off these critical choke points, it creates great problems, and we're experiencing that right now. If you recall, a few years ago, the Suez Canal, a tanker got blocked, or a cargo ship, and it stopped traffic for about a week and cost billions and billions of dollars. But now it's different. That was an accident. Now we have armed conflict. And this is what makes it different. And as Mohammed said, on February 28th, Israel and US bombed Iran. Now, let's go before that, because to understand, the straits have a special passage because they're very important communications. And I'm not going to give a lecture on all of straits, but essentially, we have different sources of law applying. The main principal treaty that currently applies in law of the sea is the Law of the Sea Convention. And under that convention, it created a new passage regime that now everyone, I think, reads about, called transit passage. That actually did not exist before the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention. And the reason was it was a compromise. When states The proposal was to extend the territorial sea to 12 nautical miles, which meant that that would encompass water that was once high seas and open to what we call freedom of navigation, meaning no coastal state could interfere, put rules, regulations on passage. So the maritime power said no. Well, we want our warships, our submarines, we want freedom of navigation. And so the compromise was something called transit passage. I say it because it's important to understand that the key difference between this new regime of transit passage, well, what existed before under customary international law, as well as the 1958 Geneva Convention. It was something called innocent passage. All right. Why is it important? Because now we keep hearing these different terminologies. What is interesting for the Strait of Hormuz is that Iran never ratified the Law of the Sea Convention, 1982, and it only recognizes that transit passage would only apply to those states who are parties because they had agreed to this package deal that I just explained, that in exchange for 12 nautical miles, transit passage. But because Iran has only signed that agreement, the convention, it actually put it in writing in its declaration when it signed it, that it would not recognize transit passage in these circumstances. What does that leave then? It would leave what we know as customary international law, non-suspendable innocent passage. Does it really? There's a lot of debate going on. So many states take the position that transit passage would apply regardless, because it's customary international law. Under international law, Iran would likely say it's a persistent objector and non-suspendable innocent passage applies. But for us, what really is important for all states is that when it comes to merchant ships, doesn't matter. They all have the right of unimpeded passage, whether it be transit or whether it be innocent passage. The big question is whether that armed attack changed things. Because suddenly, when it's an armed attack, then the laws of armed conflict come into play. And that's a whole other situation. And there we have, it's mostly customary international law when it comes to naval warfare, something called the San Remo Manual. But what's very clear under the San Remo Manual, for neutral, that means those states that are not enemy states have still the right of transit or innocent passage through straits. The problem is that it doesn't apply to the enemy states. Um, and so when the US, for example, initially proposed to give a military convoy, I can, there's a reason why that never happened, because those ships would have been targeted, under the laws of armed conflict. Having said that, we are now in a situation where the law, international law, should protect the passage of neutral merchant vessels. But the US has now also put in a blockade, which has complicated things because if the whole purpose was to open the Strait of Hormuz, the blockade is not helping this. So, to make a long story short, this is actually not the first time. We had when Iraq invaded Iran, 1980, 1987, the Hormuz Strait was again the subject of concern where merchant vessels were being targeted, attacked by all sides. But Iran never closed the strait down. And the US at that time had recognized transit passage as well. Nonetheless, it was dangerous. Ships were still being targeted, but it would seem this is the first time where the strait has closed down entirely. So the challenge is, international law, in my view, if all states had followed international law, whether it be US, Israel, and then Iran right now, we would not be in this crisis, frankly. But geopolitics, power politics is beyond the scope of my presentation. So I hope I was able to convey a little bit about the complexities of the international law landscape that is surrounding this crisis in the Hormuz Strait. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Nilofer. And it was a very insightful presentation. And I just don't want to make any comments for now and leave my question, and I'm reading the other question for the Q&A section. So we can go to Dr. Mirza, and you have 15 minutes for your presentation too. The floor is yours, Doctor.
Thank you, Dr. Hasrati. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Can everyone see my screen now?
Yes. No.
Okay, great, fantastic. So, firstly, thank you very much, Dr. Hazrati, Dr. Nilfer, for inviting me to this very timely event. And let me just mention it's a great honor to be on a panel with Dr. Chen, Professor Lim, whose work I follow regularly. So, today I'll just like to give a brief overview of the impact of the Iran war on energy security in Southeast Asia. And as Dr. Nilfer mentioned, this is a momentous event for energy security, and it has particular impacts on Southeast Asia because 80% of the oil and gas that passes through the Strait of Hormuz actually goes towards Asia. And even though in Southeast Asia, there are several countries that are producers of fossil fuels, they are still very much tied to the supply chains coming in through the Strait of Hormuz. So there has been significant impact on the prices of oil and gas and subsequent impacts on electricity prices as well as jet fuel. So, sorry, I'm just trying to go to the next slide.
It's right.
I think,
Yeah.
okay, great. So Southeast Asia is a region that's dependent on fossil fuel, much like many developing regions and also like several developed regions. So around 70% approximately of our electric generation is from fossil fuels, and 80% of our total primary energy supply is from fossil fuels. And we get around 30% of our electricity from renewable resources. So there are high levels of dependence on fossil fuels. And as I mentioned, Southeast Asia's energy security is tied to the supply chains in the Middle East. And currently, countries in the region have approximately 30 to 100 days of oil reserves. So, quite a critical scenario at this point in time. And in terms of dependence, there are high levels of dependency on oil by countries such as Philippines. Vietnam depends on gas imports from the Middle East. Malaysia and Thailand also have high levels of dependence in terms of oil. And Singapore, which gets more than 95% of its electricity from gas, actually depends quite highly in terms of LNG imports from the Middle East. So all of this is having very high levels of impact on energy security in the region. And so the most immediate impact is increases in prices of gasoline and diesel. The highest impacts are felt in the Philippines, Cambodia, and Myanmar. So, in the Philippines, we can see the gasoline going up more than 50% and diesel more than 80%. There are also increases of fuel prices in Singapore and Malaysia. But there is no change in Indonesia and relatively smaller changes in Thailand. But this is due to the absorption of inflation by government subsidies. And this essentially has a huge impact on the national economy. So, for example, Indonesia is seeking an addition of 5.9 billion to its budget to continue to subsidize fuel. And in Thailand, the state fund that actually subsidizes fuel is facing a deficit of 1.5 billion. So even though there are relatively less increases in prices in Thailand and no increase in Indonesia, the crisis is still having an impact on these Southeast Asian economies. And in terms of jet fuel prices, it has actually doubled. And according to Oxford Economics, this can have a huge impact on tourism dependent economies in Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand and the Philippines. And according to some research, if this crisis continues, then Thailand can face losses of 4.5 billion in the tourism industry. So it's not just energy security we're looking at. We're looking at an impact on the whole of economy in Southeast Asia, and this may potentially continue in the coming years. So in terms of the responses by Southeast Asian governments, there has been quite a lot of initiatives that have been undertaken by state level actors. So one of the very short-term kind of responses is increases in dependency on coal. So Indonesia has ramped up production of coal this year, while Thailand is currently reviving the retired Maimo coal-fired power plant to increase energy security, and Philippines is also ramping up coal-fired power plants, all in an effort to address this current crisis. Um, and one of the most significant steps undertaken by the Philippines is the declaration of a national state of emergency regarding energy. And this is expected to be followed up by actual policy implementation in terms of subsidies, kind of expediting energy projects and diesel reserves and other kinds of measures. And in Southeast Asia, we see some similar initiatives being undertaken in terms of working from home, limiting the supply and consumption of fossil fuels, taking some monetary and fiscal measures to address this crisis, and also kind of managing the demand for air travel. So in Indonesia, the government has implemented mandatory working from home on Fridays. And for Malaysia, there is a 3-day a week working from home. And similar initiatives are being undertaken in Philippines and Thailand just to manage the demand for energy. And there are also some measures being undertaken in relation to supply and socioeconomic measures to kind of cushion the impact of this crisis on vulnerable members of communities. So, for example, Indonesia has announced a daily purchase limit of 50 liters, but this is only for private vehicles. It does not apply to public transport vehicles. And Malaysia has increased diesel subsidy payments through April and also reduced the monthly quota on subsidized fuel. And Philippines has actually suspended taxes on fossil fuels. And both the Philippines and Thailand has undertaken measures to kind of cushion the impact on transport workers. So Philippines has actually provided a minimum daily wage for transport workers, and Thailand has undertaken a special assistance program to help transport workers involved in petrol and diesel reliant transport sectors. And in terms of the demand for flights, this has been addressed by Indonesia. So they've increased the cap of fuel surcharge to 38%, which has led to rise in airfares. And in Malaysia and Thailand, we see that Batik Air Malaysia and Thai Air, Lion Air have all reduced their flight schedules. And some of these airline companies has also increased their fares. And beyond this region, there's also interactions with extra regional players. So, for example, Singapore has kind of entered into an agreement with Australia to commit to providing essential goods, which includes LNG. So, this is a good kind of progress in terms of Australia's role in addressing this energy crisis by collaborating with the ASEAN partners. So overall, there has been quite a lot of initiatives undertaken by regional governments to kind of meet the short-term shocks of this energy crisis. And at the ASEAN level, there has been increasing discourse on the need to kind of implement the ASEAN Petroleum Security Agreement, or APSA. And this essentially was signed in 2009 and then renewed at the 43rd ASEAN Ministers on Energy meeting last year when Malaysia was the chair. And the general idea of the APSA is a regional kind of mechanism, but it is commercially based. So the idea is that if a member country is facing a shortage, which is at least 10% of their domestic requirement, then a signatory to the APSA can provide assistance voluntarily on commercial terms. So some critics say that the APSA is quite vague, and because it's voluntarily, it still hasn't been implemented to the full extent to kind of address this huge crisis in Southeast Asia. So, beyond the doom and gloom of this current crisis, Southeast Asia is still advancing on renewable energy. So, I have put some examples up on the slide. And as late as 17 April, the Philippines Department of Energy has fast-tracked 22 renewable energy projects, which includes solar, biomass, and wind. Similar initiatives are being undertaken by Cambodia, by Vietnam. So the energy transition in Southeast Asia is ongoing, regardless of these kind of geopolitical implications. But of course, these kind of supply shocks make governments make it quite difficult for governments to continue along energy transition because they are faced with the crisis of meeting the immediate energy security needs of their people. And on a regional level, ASEAN has actually increased its renewable energy target through the ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation, which is the 5-year blueprint of the region's energy transition agenda. So the last 5-year program targeted 35% capacity, and now we're looking at 45% renewable energy capacity by 2030. So we are still on the path towards energy transition, regardless of what's happening geopolitically. And in terms of energy integration, the ASEAN Power Grid is the region's grand integration agenda. And it essentially entails the integration of electricity markets, the harmonization of grids, harmonization of rules and regulations around grids, and also physical interconnections. And so far, 9 out of 18 key interconnection projects have been completed. And in the last 3 years, we have seen immense project on the APG. So in 2022, Southeast Asia moved from bilateral to multilateral energy integration with the commencing of the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore power integration project, the region's very first multilateral project. And also, Southeast Asia is currently looking at developing subsea power cables, which can be a real game changer in Southeast Asia because it's an archipelagic region, and subsea cables really can enhance energy transition by increasing the number of players. And what I mean by that is currently Southeast Asia only has overland interconnections. So a country like Vietnam can essentially trade in electricity with Laos, Cambodia, its immediate partners. But with subsea power cables, we are looking at connecting continental Southeast Asia with maritime Southeast Asia. So we will have subsea power cables between Singapore and Indonesia, between Australia and Singapore, as well as between Vietnam, Malaysia, and Singapore. So this will really increase the number of buyers and sellers of electricity and ramp up energy transition. And at the same time, these projects will really increase green industrialization in the region. So what I mean by that, if you have a gas pipeline from Singapore to from Indonesia to Singapore, that's just like a one-off infrastructure. But with the subsea power cables, we are looking at developing solar panel industries in Indonesia. We're looking at developing battery storage systems in Cambodia. So this will have a huge knock-on effect on green industrialization in Southeast Asia. And I would just like to quickly share the findings of this journal article I published last year, and it was actually edited by Professor Lim, and her colleagues. So this article essentially tried to look at great power politics and energy transition in different regions of Southeast Asia, and one of the findings was that although great powers do not collaborate as much in Southeast Asia as they do in Central Asia in terms of energy transition, Southeast Asia has a much higher level of agency and ownership over its energy transition, particularly through the ASEAN Power Grid and the ASEAN mechanisms. So even though all these geopolitical issues are confounding us, ASEAN very much has the agency, and it essentially is in the driver's seat of addressing these geopolitical issues and moving forward with energy security and energy transition. So that essentially is my presentation. I'm very sorry that I can't stay for the Q&A, but I've got my email address up there. Please do email me if you have any questions. And once again, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, we have received one question about your presentation, but I know that you are leaving after your presentation, and we don't have you for the Q&A, unfortunately. So I will send that email, that question to your email after the webinar. Okay, now we can go for from Southeast Asia to Middle East, where the crisis started. Dr. Lee Chen Sim, the floor is yours, and 15 minutes for your talk.
Right. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. I see here that all of you, most of you, or all of you actually have some kind of a NUS affiliation. Sorry, I'm just wondering, can you hear me or am I frozen?
No, we can hear you.
Okay,
Yes.
great. So I can see that all of you have some kind of a NUS affiliation, and I didn't want to be left out the party, right? So I thought I'll just throw it in there that I'm actually a graduate of NUS, so I can join all of you in your party. That's great. Now, thank you for the invitation. And my brief here was to go beyond the region and to look at this on a more global level, right? So I've structured my brief remarks around 4 questions. And I'll go through each of these 4 questions, so that you can have an idea of what my thoughts are when it comes to the more global nature of this crisis. Next slide, please. So the first question I decided to ask is, what is the global economic impact of this crisis? As Dr. Araf says, and as Dr. Hasrati said, this is an unprecedented energy crisis. So how unprecedented is it? Well, it's apparently even worse than 1973, the oil embargoes, 1979 crisis. It's like the absolute worst that we have experienced historically. So how bad it is? Well, I would say that there are actually 2 kinds of shocks that the world is experiencing. One is a price shock, and that one Dr. Mercer has mentioned. It's a price shock whereby you see, very high prices for oil and of course for gas as well. And I won't repeat that because Dr. Mercer mentioned examples of price shocks. But a second shock is in terms of supply shock. Now, supply shock is when you actually have a physical shortage of oil and gas. And we've seen how in Europe, for example, there has been predictions that in 6 weeks' time, Europe will face an actual shortage of jet fuel. So that's a supply shock, right? So most countries first will experience a supply shock, and then if the crisis goes on, you will experience a supply shock. Now, the second point about how bad is the economic impact, the global impact, is that the impact is quite uneven. You have some countries which, are dealing better with it. Dr. Mercer gave some examples. China and Japan, for example, are dealing a bit better with it because they have strategic oil reserves and also commercial oil reserves, whereas countries like Thailand and Jordan don't have as much reserves. So some countries are dealing better with it. Some countries have got renewable power, they've got coal power, they've got nuclear power, which can take the strain off oil and gas. So countries are dealing, the impact is very, very different. I've put up those 2 fancy looking pictures, charts for you there, just to show you how uneven the impact is. For countries in the red zone, those are feeling the impact very heavily, and those are generally the Asian countries. In the green zone, you have generally the European countries, dealing a bit better because, as I said, they have other sources of energy to tie them over with. Even in terms of LNG, which is the second chart there, Again, you have the European countries dealing a bit better with it because their LNG doesn't go through Hormuz as much as the Asian countries in the red box in the second chart. Much of the energy in Hormuz, including LNG, goes through Hormuz. So the Asian countries are more affected. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we said that it was an energy crisis, and Dr. Mercer has mentioned it's actually not just energy, right? It's a bigger crisis. Now, in terms of oil and gas, yes, it is about crude oil, it is about LNG, but as you can see from the chart on the top, it is also about products. It's about LPG, which is used for cooking fuel in Indonesia. It is also about jet fuel, which you use for flying. And for those of you having summer plans, I'm sorry you're gonna have to pay higher prices. It's also about fuel oil, which is what they use in power plants in Bangladesh, right? In the Middle East, they also use some fuel oil. So it's not just about the crude oil and gas, it's also about the derivatives that come from that. And to even push the picture further, it's not just about what you think of as oil and gas products, it's also about non-energy materials. For example, if you look at the chart at the bottom at the base metals, I've highlighted in green copper and nickel. What in the world does copper and nickel have to do with this current seemingly energy crisis? Well, a lot, right? Because you have products that are made from gas producers, things like sulfur, which is needed for copper and for nickel, right? So because sulfur cannot get out through the Hormuz because of the current blockade, therefore major producers in Indonesia, for example, cannot produce as much copper and nickel, and hence you can see there's a price difference between the blue dots and the red dots in those two highlighted boxes. So again, it's not just an energy crisis, it also affects base metal commodities, etc. Next slide, please. So for the second question I posed here is, can this crisis, energy and non-energy crisis, can it actually get worse, right? And I'm sorry to bring you bad news, but yes, it absolutely can get worse, not just for the energy exporters, but also for energy importers, right? So there's many banks, many investment houses have come up with scenarios of a better outcome and a less bad outcome, as you can see from the chart on the top. So oil prices absolutely can go higher, as you can see in the red line scenario 2. It can also go lower depending on what happens in three things. How long is the conflict going to take? What is the intensity? Is it just energy processing that's being affected? Is it the actual oil fields itself? Is it ports that export the energy? Intensity of the conflict? And the third thing is, what's going to happen to the Iranian regime? Is it going to have a more benevolent regime? Is it going to dissolve into utter chaos? So all these three things working together can actually make the conflict a lot worse. Not just for the Middle East, not just for oil exporters, but also for the rest of the world, as you see in the chart at the bottom, which predicts, depending on the scenario, GDP can get impacted even worse in the red scenario. So can inflation. So it can absolutely get worse. Next slide, please. And Dr. Mercer mentioned this, and I thought I'd like to touch on this. Is this current so-called energy crisis, is it actually a good thing for the energy transition, right? Is it a good thing for renewables? Dr. Mercer gave some example. Now, there is a general feeling that because of the war in the Middle East and the disruptions in Hormuz, that automatically means that it's a good thing for renewables. But I would actually like to beg to differ, and my equation would be more like the war and the blockade is actually going to make governments think more seriously about energy security measures. And this does not automatically mean renewable energy. What it actually means is that there would be more focus on domestically developed or indigenous energy resources. And what this indigenous resource looks like differs depending on different countries. In Southeast Asia, which has been a laggard on renewables, they will increase renewables, as Dr. Mirza said. But at the same time, Indonesia could do coal switching, right? They switch from gas to use a bit more coal because coal is indigenous to Indonesia. In Europe, the answer is different. The indigenous materials would be things like, say, nuclear, which they already have quite a lot of nuclear plants. They could restart them. They, especially the ones that have just been closed, they could do more renewables. In the Gulf, the answer could also be more renewables, but also more oil and gas, right? So it doesn't mean that this particular conflict is automatically going to translate into more renewables. What it's going to translate into is that countries are going to have a conversation about energy security, and renewables will be part of that conversation, but it may not necessarily drive the entire conversation. Next slide, please. And for the final question that I structured my short remarks around is this question of will the Strait, as Dr. Oral mentioned, will the Strait of Hormuz actually be irrelevant because of this crisis? Because countries are trying to find workarounds, particularly the oil and gas exporters. What happens in the Middle East in this case, unfortunately, does not stay in the Middle East. And this is why this question is crucial, not just for oil exporters, but for those who import oil and gas through Hormuz, right? Now, there have been many fancy suggestions of a bypass around Hormuz, and those are the two suggestions that you see in the charts there. One is to actually carve a canal, an artificial canal, right through from the Gulf down to the Arabian Sea, somewhere around Oman. So that's actually carving the canal there on the chart on the right. A left one is a multimodal transport artery from some of the Gulf states through to Israel, through to Europe, right? So those are some of the bypass routes for Hormuz, on the assumption that, you want Hormuz not to hold you hostage, right? And those are the ideas. Now, again, whether Hormuz will be irrelevant or not depends on three things. What is the duration of the conflict? The longer the duration, the more attractive permanent bypasses become. The more intense the conflict, the longer it goes on, the more intense, the more targets are hit, the more bypasses will become financially and politically more acceptable. If Iran dissolves into utter chaos, that there are different groups that take control of Hormuz, again, permanent bypasses become more attractive. My best guess to those who are looking at this and trying to get a read on that, just click the enter button, please. My best guess would be that there will be a combination of one of these two routes, right? Number one, there will be some degree of cooperation among Gulf states to say, try to link their export routes to, let's say, Duqm in Oman, or it could even be a different port in Oman, like Salalah or some other Omani ports, because the Omani ports bypass Hormuz, right? They have their own outlet to the sea. So that would be what some Gulf states are going to try to do, to try to link their different export routes to some of these Omani ports. But I think in the short, but that will take time. In the short term, what's going to happen is that I gather that there will be more road and rail transport in each of these Gulf states, right? Whether that links through to Saudi Arabia's port on the Red Sea, which avoids Hormuz, even like a rail transport from UAE to Oman for the sulfur exports, not just oil and gas, for the aluminum exports. So this kind of within Gulf, more extra routes by sea and by road and by rail, that would be the short-term response. It will not necessarily make Hormuz irrelevant, but it will build some kind of resilience and redundancy into export routes. Why won't this be permanent? Because of something that Dr. Aral mentioned earlier. A very large crude carrier, Dr. Aral, you mentioned that, right? It's slow as a bicycle, right? It's slow, yes, but it carries a lot of crude, right? To even replace one VLCC, very large crude carrier, with road, let's say by trucks, you could put the oil onto trucks and transport them across to safer ports. But in order to do that, you need at least 10,000 trucks. 10,000 trucks for one VLCC. Imagine how many trucks you would need, how much oil you would need to transport all that oil, right? So that's a little bit kind of, it's a non-starter. You just have too many trucks, you don't have enough roads and stuff like that. So But in any case, most countries are hoping that Hormuz will kind of still be open. But at the same time, they are going to go for some of these road and rail links to make Hormuz a bit less vulnerable to Hormuz. So I'm going to stop there with my best guess, and I'm happy to take any questions later on. Thank you.
Great, Dr. Sim. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I'm sure that our audience have lots of questions, and feel free to submit your question in the Q&A box. I have also a question for your presentation, but I keep that question for the end as well. Let's go to China, and then Dr. Gan will hear your presentation for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, and I'm very happy to join this panel on very timely panel on this very important topic. So my job today is to provide some kind of China perspective. I really don't know whether China has a unified official perspective on the ongoing crisis in the Middle East. But I'm trying to give you some kind of my own assessment of the impact upon China's economy and how China is viewing the situation, which is still evolving at a very fast speed. First of all, on China's economy, I think this is a topic that many people are interested in. So if you read the reports, a lot of media reports are now saying that China is pretty resilient and is well prepared. Actually, I'm more pessimistic than these media reports about the impact upon Chinese economy. I do think that the ongoing Middle East crisis would pose a kind of slow pain for Chinese economy. It will gradually squeeze China's economy and become a major challenge for China to fulfill this year's economic growth of about 4.5% to 5%. So this is very interesting. For the first time, China raised its annual growth target to 4.5% this year. I think China announced the growth target only a few days after the outbreak of the U.S.-Israel Iran war. So I do think that the Chinese central government has already factored in the negative impact upon China's economy. So 5% already is a pretty low growth target. And this year, for the first time, the government has announced has set the economic growth target at 4.5%, which indicated that Chinese government also knows that this kind of crisis, if it drags on for a very long time, it can pose very significant negative impact upon Chinese economy. In terms of energy security, we all know that actually China is less dependent upon Middle East crude oil and gas than its Southeast Asian or East Asian neighbors. Many East Asian countries like Japan, Korea, or Philippines actually depend like 70 to 90% of their oil consumption upon the crude oil from the Middle East. For China, I think the situation is much better because China's energy self-efficiency rate is about 83%. Oil consumption only accounts for 17% of China's total energy consumption, and about 2/3 of this oil consumption comes from overseas, and about half of this kind of imports is from the Middle East. So roughly about 6% of China's energy consumption is from the Middle East. But since China is the world's largest energy consumer, so any gap between the supply and the demand could be substantial in terms of absolute quantity. So we cannot underestimate this kind of impact. So if China has a 1% gap in terms of total energy consumption, it would have a much larger impact upon the global energy price than other countries' consumption gap. Secondly, I think more importantly, I think we can not only just look at the impact from the energy sectors. More importantly, I think these kind of energy, the oil and the transport bottleneck would pose a bigger challenge to China's long-term economic growth, because oil is refined not only into fuels but also into other feedstocks like naphthas, which are essential for production of many products. China is the world's largest manufacturing hub. So without this, the sufficient supply of the crude oil as the backbone of manufacturing, China may face a shortage and also bottleneck in producing plastics, synthetic fibers, rubber, and other chemicals. So all these will impact China's export. We know that now China's economic situation, especially domestic consumption situation, is not very good. The property market is also in a downturn situation. So more than 1/3 of China's economic growth comes from the export last year. So if the export is going to be hit hard by the shortage of crude oil, of the petrochemical materials, I think that would have a very substantial impact upon China's economic performance this year. So I do think that may be one of the reasons why the government has lowered its growth target to 4.5%. And if we look at the IMF's estimation, I think they also lowered the expectation for China's economic growth this year to about 4.5%. I think now the key issue is about the duration of this kind of conflict and the bottleneck or the blockade. It's not really about the intensity of the conflict. If this kind of blockade or the transport bottleneck will last for a very long time, especially if the duration would outlast the period that China's strategic oil reserve can sustain, about 200 days, I do think that would pose a very serious strategic and macro level challenge to China's economic performance. So 200 days is about 7 months. So if this kind of blockade or the bottleneck will last more than 7 months, and if the blockade will also extend from the Hormuz Strait to the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait, the Red Sea area, I think that would even pose a more serious challenge to China's export, because a lot of cargo transport also goes through the Red Sea waters. So the issue is that to what extent can the Chinese economy cope with the bottleneck, the transportation bottleneck, as well as the crude oil supply shortage. In the short run, China is still resilient. China also has a large capacity in terms of renewables, like the solar, wind, and hydropower. But the problem for these renewables is that the efficiency of using the capacity is not very high. And also in some sectors, like the aviation fuels, and also just now I mentioned oil as a kind of industrial feedstock, they cannot be replaced or substituted by the renewable energy like solar and wind power. So I do think that China is watching this crisis closely. In the first months, I don't think China was doing a lot on the diplomatic front. But recently, I think we have all noticed that China's foreign minister, Wang Yi, stepped out and also joined this kind of mediation process. China is trying to play a more active role in brokering the peace process in the Middle East. Of course, I don't think China can have China's role is quite limited because China also does not have very good relationship with the United States right now. So the issue is that to what extent can China affect the peace process in the Middle East, and to what extent can the situation come back to the pre-war level? That will be essential for China's economy. Otherwise, I do think that if the war will last, or the blockade or the bottleneck will last for more than 7 months, China's economy would be in serious trouble. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chengan. And I think we now can go to the Q&A section. And I go to, this section directly without, taking time too much, because we have received many questions. So we try to take as many as questions possible. So the first question we have here, I think it's the first question is for Dr. Niloufar. And the question goes like, if Iran decides to impose fees in return for providing services, would this be legally permissible under either the transit passage or innocent passage regimes? This is the first question, and I have my own question as well. That's just about, sorry, just this one is the privilege of being moderator. Innocent passage is a customary international law, but what about transit passage? Is it customary international law or not?
Okay, thank you so much. And also many thanks to our panelists for their very informative presentations. So to the first question, easy to answer that, no. Under international law, whether it be under the conventions or customary international law, the charging of tolls for passage through a strait, whether it be innocent passage or transit passage, is not permitted. This is something that's actually in the convention itself. The only way it could possibly permit it, that's very rare, is under long-standing agreements, and the only one that I know of is the one for the Turkish Straits that dates back to 1936. And it's not a toll, it's specifically for certain services. And also I should add that there is a provision that allows for transit passage, and the Strait of Malacca is the only one that has that, not to charge tolls, but it's a way of cooperation voluntarily under Article 43 of the Law of the Sea Convention. And I think it's been quite successful for the Malacca Straits, where the user states or flag states can contribute to cover the costs of running a strait. So that's pretty clear, even though that's been raised, but that I think would be very disruptive to the system. And it's not just straits. You can't pay, innocent passage through territorial sea. Also, you cannot pay. The whole idea of whether it be innocent passage or transit passage, whether it be through the straits or the territorial sea or archipelagic waters as well, is underscoring the importance of unhindered passage, because we have all now seen how important the ocean is for communications, and how much of, and our experts here, whether it be energy, trade, without shipping, we would not have the prosperity we have today. That's just it. But if states, coastal states, start putting blockages, money, one issue, any type of condition of passage, this can have impacts as far as, from Hormuz to China to Asia. So I think we have to look at the big picture of this. Now, when you talk, just to get to your question, innocent passage is clearly customary international law. Transit passage, was created under the law of the Sea Convention. This was in 1982 and it was adopted and it entered into force in 1994. What is customary international law? You have to have widespread usage by states and plus the belief that it is an obligation. Many states, including Singapore, take the view that transit passage is customary international law. It is a question that I cannot sit here and answer because you have to do a study of, the practice itself. But what makes it difficult for Iran in the Iranian case is if Iran is a persistent objector, which is a whole other international law, which is recognized. The question is then, even if transit passage is customary international law, whether it applies against Iran. But Iran would still have to apply non-suspendable innocent passage. And just to underline, the main difference really has to do with the passage of submarines and overflight. And that. So merchant ships would still have the right to unimpeded passage, no tolls, no conditions. And so I think that really is the most important aspect of that. But we can, debate whether transit passage is customary international law. There are probably many states who do take that view.
Thank you. Thank you for your comprehensive answer. So the next question, I think it goes for Dr. Chengan. And the question is, do you see the energy transition as simply shifting dependence from oil and gas to critical minerals, and therefore on states like China and concentrated supply chains? And if so, how long might it take, particularly for developing countries, to achieve genuine energy security, and what short-term pathways are available in the interim? So the question is, I think Dr. Sim answered that, partially. She said that the energy security crisis is not automatically lead to energy transition, but if energy transition is one way to ensure energy security for long term, so does it mean that countries will go through one dependency to another dependence?
Yeah, I do think so, but I don't see the transition yet. Up to now, I think the development of renewable energy in the world is not fast enough for us to fill up the gap that has been created by this Middle East crisis. As I said just now, even for China, I think we all know that China is one of the best performers in the world in terms of developing renewable energy capacity, as well as producing renewable energy equipments like wind turbines and solar panels, which needs the critical minerals a lot. But I still don't see that. This kind of development can really help those countries, especially major economies like China, reduce its dependency upon the crude oil and gas, especially those from the Middle East yet. So the transition is not fast enough. And also China does have the leverage over the critical minerals, as we have seen last year, especially for the tariff war. China has the leverage, especially over the United States. But that doesn't mean that China can control the whole supply chain of the renewable energy production. So now I see the weaknesses of China. China has in the conventional energy sectors actually is still larger than the advantage it has in the renewable energy sector.
Thank you. So we have two questions for Dr. Sim. The first one is, goes like this: on bypassing the Strait of Hormuz, how hopeful can we be for an alignment between the Gulf states, given that some of them, for example, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the UAE, have ports on the Red Sea, the Gulf of Oman, and or the Arabian Sea? and are striving to export oil through these ports despite the ongoing closure of the Strait of Hormuz? This is the first question. And the second question, I'll give you the two questions and then you can answer both together. It says that, do you think that pursuing closer relations with Iran would be a better political strategy to reopen the strait rather than investing in pipelines or curbing, which would take considerable time?
Okay, thank you for the questions. So I'm actually going to answer three questions because the previous one to Dr. Chen Gang, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in there because the person asked whether we are substituting one dependency, fossil fuel, for another, right? Renewables. And for me, I think if the transition goes ahead and if we do, assuming that it's a renewable energy transition, there is this fear, right? Substituting one dependency for another. But from my point of view, the two dependencies are very different. Fossil fuel dependency is consistent, right? And you always need LNG, you always need LPG, you always need oil for your cars or for your fossil fuels. So it's a constant feeding, a constant kind of dependency. But renewable energy, one is very different. Because in renewable energy, once you have the solar panels, whether you get it from China or from India or wherever, once you get the solar panels, once you get the inverters, once you get a solar a molten salt tower, once you get the wind turbines, once everything is built, right? The energy that you need comes from the sun and the wind. And you don't need to ship panels every 6 months or every 2 weeks like you do need for fossil fuels. It's once the project ends, you don't really need it until say 20 years later when you need to change the panels or upgrade them or stuff like that. So it's a really very different kind of dependency. You have much more control over renewables because they're indigenously generated. They're from solar and wind. So that's my first response. The second question on alignment is an interesting one. So I had mentioned that I think that there would be more sort of like intra-Gulf cooperation to increase the Hormuz bypass, and I still stand by that for some reasons. Because one, Saudi Arabia wants to be more of a hub, the transportation hub for the Gulf, because it's got a Red Sea bypass, right? So it's going to want to try to increase the number of multimodal transport, whether it's rail or roads, that the other Gulf states have, right? So if it wants to be so-called the leader of the Gulf, that's one of the sources of leverage that it has, right? Having a actual Red Sea bypass. The UAE's bypass through to Fujairah from its port to Fujairah, it's not foolproof because it only handles part of the UAE's exports. It's not a full replacement, right, for the volume for its exports. And the UAE actually wants to increase its exports, so it's not a full replacement for Hormuz. So in that sense, the UAE will be keen on looking for other bypass routes, whether it's through Saudi or whether it's through Oman, right? And for all these players who have bypass routes, their facilities have actually been hit, right? They've got pumping stations in the UAE that have been hit, even though it's a Hormuz bypass. You've got oil fields in Saudi, which has been hit. The pipeline itself, the bypass pipeline has been hit. So even for all these countries with a bypass option, they would still benefit from having other cooperation of other Gulf states, especially if Oman, for a more resilient export route. The third question on Iran, absolutely, right? The Gulf states would love to have better relations with Iran, and that would be, more financially palatable. And in terms of timing, some of these bypasses would take 10 years, just to get approvals for environment, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely better relations with Iran it's a good thing. But Iran is kind of like a festering problem, right? It crops up every decade or so. There is an issue, but Iran is also a neighbor. So the Gulf states know they have to live with Iran, and the best case scenario would be if they could get along. But it's always a question of what if, right? They do not want Hormuz to be held hostage by Iran. So I think you will start to see some of these less costly bypass. But I would say that eventually the question is correct. the biggest obstacle is not the technical possibility, it's not technical skills to have a bypass, it's not money, the Gulf states are rich enough, it's about political relations and whether you want to depend on your other Gulf neighbors, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers. And we have lots of questions. We received lots of questions. I'm not sure how many of those questions we can take, but we try and we do our best. Dr. Niloufar, we have one more question for you. The question says, the non-suspendable right of innocent passage would leave coastal states with a greater competence to regulate the passage and also to deny passage when it is non-innocent. Would that be acceptable even for maritime merchant traffic?
So if I understand the question, so non-suspendable innocent passage, it's non-suspendable in straits, not in territorial seas. And we say innocent passage, meaning that it shall not during passage, not to threaten the peace and security of the coastal state, but that applies also to transit passage. So both passages, it has to be peaceful passages. So the question is, again, repeat, because
the question asks, because it gives more competence to regulate the passage to the coastal state, would it be acceptable by merchant traffic?
more acceptable, I guess, than what? Transit passage, I guess.
Uh,
Yeah, there are some differences, of course, if we want to get into details. One thing I didn't mention, by the way, is that there is a traffic separation scheme in the Strait of Hormuz that was established in 1973 that continues. And that was established jointly by Oman and Iran. And we always forget about Oman. Oman is also a strait on the bordering the Strait of Hormuz. So that is operational, meaning that in transit passage, or because Oman adopts transit passage. So again, that's what makes the Hormuz Strait interesting. But they still have a traffic separation scheme. The one difference between transit passage and innocent passage, if we're getting into technical details, you can still impose traffic separation schemes and other navigational schemes for safety of navigation, in particular, and protection of the marine environment. But for transit passage, you have to get the approval of the International Maritime Organization. And an innocent passage, why you have to still get consult, the approval is entirely up to the coastal state. So there are differences, but at the end of the day, again, I keep saying in both cases, the coastal state cannot put arbitrary conditions that would have the effect of impeding their passage, whether it be transit passage or non-suspendable innocent passage. There are differences, but that certainly is what no tolls and any type of safety regulation, there's a process that has to go through that as well. So I hope I answered the question.
Clear enough, I think. Yes, thank you. And Dr. Sim, there is one question asking about how can the global pursuit of energy security and the rapid energy transition be considered sustainable when geopolitical competition for critical minerals is driving unregulated mining in Southeast Asia, particularly Myanmar, with transboundary environmental impacts on neighboring countries? If you mind, you answer this question.
Sure, it's a great question. Now, when we talk about the energy transition, we normally talk about something called the 4 A's. Okay, what drives the energy transition? 4 A's. The A's are availability. Do we have enough of the energy, right? Affordability. Can we afford energy? The third A, accessibility. Can we actually receive or get the shipments of this kind of energy? And the fourth A is acceptability. Is this fuel acceptable to societies? And your question, Arisara, relates to the fourth A, which is acceptability, right? Is the energy transition going to be sustainable? And my answer to whether it's in Southeast Asia or whether it's in other countries, and my answer would be this. Of these four A's that I've talked about, availability, affordability, accessibility, acceptability, right now, of what policymakers have been focused on is availability and affordability, right? The sustainability, the acceptability part comes at the end, right? Unfortunately, this is how the real world is at the moment. We are more focused on, do we have enough supplies? Are they cheap enough? Rather than, are they green enough, right? So this is the trade-off that the policymakers are making, especially right now at this critical moment. They are trading off sustainability for cheap and availability. So yes, you're completely right. Critical minerals mining is very energy intensive, and it is not very sustainable. But at this particular moment in time, they will focus on cheapness and availability. Though I will say that in terms of critical minerals mining, companies going forward are going to think more about the sustainability issue. So they're going to be able to do things like hybrid energy resources when you're mining. So can you bring in hybrid like batteries and stuff like that to make your mining more sustainable, right? Can you use methods that are more sustainable? That's going to be the future. But for the present moment, unfortunately, that's a trade-off.
Great, great. Thank you. And I think we can just go for the last question because we are running out of time. And that question is, I think, the open question for all panelists. It says, "Dear panelists, thank you for your insightful presentations. Could you please elaborate more on how much time does each area, European, South Asian, etc., of importers and exporters have before the effect of difficulty, inability of passage are irreversible? And what would be the time point from which onwards the states affected by the situation would turn away from the strait and look for alternative solutions? Lastly, if and when the situation is reverted, would it take more time to recover from this disruption? Thank you." So if the question is too long for you to follow it up, you can find it in the Q&A as well. The last question is this one. And if you have any comments or answer to this question, please feel free to start.
Yeah,
Okay.
maybe I can start. I'll
Yes.
try to answer this question. I think the duration of this conflict would be the key. Yeah, so it's not only about the intensity of the conflict, but more about the duration of this kind of bottleneck disruption. I do think that 2 months would be from now would be a critical period. We can have a close watch at because up to now we are still, most countries still fine. I think can manage the challenge. It's like the frog being slowly boiled in hot water. So up to now, day by day, I think everyone is still okay. Yeah, but 1 month later, 2 months later, situation can be very critical for some countries, because I said many countries, the national oil reserve can only last about 90 days, 3 months. So already we have passed 1.5 months. So maybe another 2 months, then we'll face a critical moment. For countries like China and Japan, their strategic oil reserve can sustain like 7 months, more than 200 days. But after another 3 to 4 months, I think it will be also critical even for these big economies. So I do think for this war of attrition, the most important variable would be the time frame, which is very important. That's why I think this question is very relevant to the topic we are discussing. It's not really about every day, what kind of shock, what kind of impact would this kind of crisis have upon every country's economy. It's about 2-3 months from now, what would be the impact? Yeah, that would be substantial. For Europe, I think it would be maybe a little bit better. I think just now Dr. Huda mentioned 80% of the oil through the Hormuz Strait goes to Asia. So this problem, unfortunately, is an Asian problem. Although United States and Israel started the war in the first place, who is suffering? Yeah, I think it's most Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, East Asian countries, and South Asian countries. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Dr. Sim, do you want to answer this question?
Yes, a great question. So I'm going to tackle the one about, Dr. Chen mentioned that the duration is very important. It's key, right? Well, I agree with that. I would also argue that intensity is very important, especially for the Gulf exporters, right? At the moment, only the mid and downstream assets have been mostly hit. So you get refineries, you get pumping stations, these kinds of things, pipelines that have gotten hit. So far, the oil fields have not really been hit. There've been, there's some, but it's not major that they've been recovering. Now, the intensity will come in if they start hitting oil fields, right? And then there's just zero production. Okay, so that's where the intensity comes in, and even then, the bypass pipeline will not help if there is no production at all. So I think intensity does matter for the effects, particularly on Asia, as Dr. Chen mentioned. Right now, a lot of these investment houses, your JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, or Goldman Sachs, they have all increased the duration of when they expect Hormuz to be disrupted, right? Most were thinking about 6 months. Now they're thinking about, thinking about 6 weeks. And now they're thinking about even, say in May or June, they'll be disrupted for another few months. So there is an increased expectation that the Hormuz disruption is going to continue, unfortunately. So the duration part is going to be, even longer. So that spells, even worse for Asia. But I would say that, yes, Europe is less affected. But again, it depends on which product you're talking about, right? So Asia has got the refineries. So as long as you can get some crude in, you can have some refined oil. Europe doesn't have as many refineries. So when it comes to jet fuel or gasoline, that's where the biggest problem is, right? So again, it really depends on which fuel you're talking about. Whether countries have stockpiles. Helium, which is something we have not mentioned. Helium is used a lot for MRI scanners, for example. Yes, most companies have stocks of helium, but if the duration and intensity goes on and there's no helium supplies coming from the Gulf, then you're going to have MRI machines that are going to run out of ability to scan, and you're going to have a health problem as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can stop here as we're running out of time, and now I know that some of our speakers have to go to another meeting. So if you're interested to find out more about the work of the CIL Energy Law and Policy Team, as well as information on energy-related developments, do follow our dedicated LinkedIn account and sign up for our mailing list on the CIL website. Our podcast series, Energy Matter at CIL, is also available on the CIL website. The series seeks to share research and contribute to capacity building within Southeast Asia on energy law and policy issue of international importance and regional relevance. With that, we will conclude today's webinar. The record of this webinar will be uploaded on the CIL website as well in a few days. I would like to thank to our speakers for their excellent presentations. Thank you, and all participants for their engagement. We hope this discussion has been informative and thoughtful, thought-provoking. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.